Welcome to Power Lunch Live on Friday morning, afternoon, wherever you are. But thank you for joining us today on this special edition. We don't normally do it on Fridays, but we've got a great guest today, and we couldn't resist. Part of the show is to bring on today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, CEOs, corporate leaders, people who are doing amazing work in the world that we can learn from and get better. So that's the whole point. We want to learn from them so that so we can do better at what we do. Now, the way that happens is if you ask questions, and you can do that on this program. You can type a message with your fingers right in the little box there below on whatever platform you're listening to, and we'll try to respond to those questions during the program. You can do that on Facebook. You can do it on Twitter. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it on LinkedIn, of course. I don't know if you can ask questions on Twitch. I've never tried it, but we're also broadcasting on Twitch, and I think probably something else that I'm missing right off. But nonetheless, you can communicate with us and ask your questions so that you can learn what you want to learn. Now, if you like the program, give it a like or share, and so that we can reach your network, and so they can benefit from these conversations, and so that obviously so we can grow our audience. It's a nice side benefit there. Now, today I've got Deepa Prahalad. I think I just killed your name. I'm sorry.
No, you're actually very close. That's fine.
Author. She's an author and speaker and internationally acclaimed innovation and design strategist. She's co-author of The Predictable Magic. I can't speak English today. Sorry. Unleash the power of design strategy to transform your business. She's a contributor to Huffington Post, Harvard Business Review, and she's a fellow Marshall Goldsmith 100 coach. Deepa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Rhett.
Yeah, you're welcome. We're going to get through this. We both have colds, and I know we're going to take breaks to blow our nose here, but that's okay. We're going to power through this. But thank you so much. I mean, you're doing some fascinating work and have written extensively on design strategy. But the first question I have is, what is design strategy?
Well, yes, I think this is the really critical issue today for both, large companies and startups alike. As a lot of the strategic challenges that all of us are facing today really require design, not just the kind of right ideas. A lot of the things like sustainability, workforce engagement, intellectual capital, talent, all of these things really require the design of new systems and products to enable, the results we seek. So if you look at a startup, for example, a lot of the design is really the difference between somebody telling you have a great idea and somebody actually placing an order. So it's a way to communicate both your abilities and your intentions, what you stand for, which is becoming a really important thing for brands, the way things are made. And so you really have two things that you can utilize. One is the physical design of the product and service, and the other is the narrative around it. Why was it created? Why was it done that way? And I think when people think about design, traditionally, they tend to think about the aesthetic aspects of, packaging and all of the colors and things. Those are familiar, and those are a little bit easier to replicate. So even very sophisticated aesthetics like Apple, Samsung was able to do it such a good copy that they were sued 2 years later. So that's not as much of a lasting advantage. But the really important thing about design is that it allows you to connect emotionally with your audience. So the emotional connection, the narrative, and the creation of community, those are much harder to replicate, but they can also be designed. And so the premise is really that really the difference between a lot of products that succeed and versus, the 80 to 90% of them that don't, even in established markets, is that ability to forge an emotional connection, have people interested in what you're going to do next and what you stand for, as well as that ability to create a community around whatever it is you're doing.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember in the toy company, the products that really did well, it wasn't necessarily just the physical design of the product, but it was the story behind it that caught people's attention, or the backstory a little bit, or the however we framed the narrative. And the ones that didn't, I think we failed on that other side to create a compelling sort of story, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you're absolutely right. How do you, is it, so I think a lot of products fail, a lot of things fail because of that second piece there. How do you do a better job at trying to create that narrative or create that story to give your product a better chance to be successful? Is there a way to sort of figure that out? Is there I don't know if you understand the question. I don't know if I understand the question.
No, I think you're getting at something really important. I think people used to design something and then really look to the marketing and branding people to say, create this great ad and everything. But today, because of evolution of technology and everything, we can actually take a lot of people's, not fully articulated desires and aspirations and actually use those as a basis for the physical design, and then again reinforce those with the story itself.
Okay.
So I think if you look at everything from makeup to Instant Pot to everything, you kind of look at this as really design as a dialogue. You put something out there, but then you always create that channel for feedback and make people feel heard with your next round and second round. And, if you look at something like Dyson, nobody would think that, the richest industrial designer in the world would have become that way, designing something as mundane as a vacuum cleaner. But it's really that merging of both the design and narrative that's very powerful. So if you look at, market research, nobody would have ever said, please give me something that's 3 times the price of everything else. Please make it bright yellow. And by the way, take away the bag because I have some kind of morbid fascination with all the crap coming out of my carpet, right? And this was a design that was rejected repeatedly, but we've all responded to something about that narrative of somebody who didn't quit, who was willing to do 5,000 iterations. And it's created this real appetite for what are you doing next? Oh, dryer, the $300 hair dryer. And this is something that is actually repeatable in different categories. It doesn't really matter where you start. But I think the most important thing to remember is that there isn't some mythical endpoint that all of us need to go toward. The really critical thing is trust is critical to emotional connection. It's not to have the coolest thing. What you need to do is have a design, a physical design, and a narrative that are mutually reinforcing. Enjoy a nice homemade mac and cheese with the same enthusiasm that I enjoy, the latest sushi presented on some, fancy plate. What I need to know is that what's promised and what's delivered are consistent. And that is the really critical piece. If you're designing the macaroni and cheese, don't make a promise for, some fancy Moscow Mule. Just set expectations. And when you set and meet expectations, you create the intimacy, you create the trust, and you find the people who care about what you're trying to do.
No, I think you're right. And that's I think often where the breakdown is, right? How do you, you've talked about how innovation is becoming, is more complex and difficult. Why do you think that is?
Well, for a few reasons. I think one is there's really been a change in kind of the narrative about what business is existing to do, right? This idea of business as a force for good. So you're also being asked to not just execute, on whatever product or service, at a fairly flawless level, but now companies, you see everything from Larry Fink to the Business Roundtable saying, we want to actually make the world a better place. And we're trying to put in measures to say, well, we'll have impact far outside our company walls on society, on the environment. So the mission has become a lot larger. We
Right.
also have a lot of people who want to lend their voices to that process, right? So there's millions of hours of data that is uploaded on social media, videos, everything. And there are some people who are really able to create this following and contribute important ideas, but sorting out that signal versus noise is a really difficult task. And on a lot of issues, there isn't a clear endpoint as well, right? So you have something like sustainability. Well, okay, how do we approach that? I mean, there some people, even in something simple like packaging, there are some people who are saying, you know what we need to do is we need to make something so durable and so beautiful that people don't throw it away after using it once. It should last for multiple uses. There are other people who are saying, no, actually, it needs to be compostable. It should disappear entirely. So when you have something like an infectious disease, the challenge is, okay, I need to figure out a vaccine, but you know what you need to do. When
Right.
it's a lifestyle disease, there isn't a single point, way to address obesity or diabetes or whatever. So you have to respect individual choices along the way, and you have to really have a wide variety of answers. And that becomes this basis for competition. But on the other hand, I think that's the huge opportunity business has, is to create a lot of choices and really allow people to find their way, and find a way that's works better for all parties.
Do you think that I mean, I totally get what you're saying, and I agree with it. Is it so? But a lot of what that is you now have social impact, and your customer really driving some decision making, right?
Mhm.
So depending on your if you're a consumer products company, for example, and your customers, they want to be able to recycle the box, they want it to be biodegradable or whatever. I mean, that really then impacts your design. It impacts your strategy. It impacts your bottom line. I mean, it's so I mean it's really more complicated. It is a lot more complicated.
Absolutely. And that's where I think that, keeping things that's another reason why design is so powerful, because I think that information alone can't really shift behavior. What happens is design is powerful because it gives people an alternative that, they don't have to wrestle with all this stuff single-handedly. So, I mean, I'm not going to solve the debate about whether we should be vegetarian or non-vegetarian with debate. But maybe
Right.
if I create a plant-based meat that a lot of people can try, and brands can figure out how to make this taste better and become more palatable to a wide range of people, then I can have impact. So I think design is just critical for moving people away from kind of these endless circular debates into a place where we can test and understand work. Um, and when people design to a degree where people can then, a large community can respond, then we can get to that iterative process and go through it much more quickly. So, if you look at something like a Tesla or a Prius, there's this long, path, but then once people get on it, that process of synthesis is going to enter everything, even if it's not a pure electric car. The pressure for better mileage, the pressure for all of these things kind of goes out into the world, and you can actually have a lot of impact that way.
I mean, do you think how is the consumer going to drive this in the future? I mean, how is the consumer going to do it? What do you think about that? I mean, how is the consumer going to impact business decisions going forward in terms of design, sustainability, all these things that we've been talking about?
Well, I think they've always been very good at raising those issues. And I think that obviously business has a direct interest in trying to synthesize that. But this is going to be interesting because in a lot of categories where we're seeing these huge problems with waste, with all of these challenges, a lot of that has actually been from solving the consumer issue. I mean, I love, my disposable contact lenses and all these other things. And then you kind of see, wow, well, wait a minute, even people are trying to ban single-use straws. So what has 10 years of disposable contact lenses and the packaging
Right.
really done, you know? So a lot of things, actually, people are quite responsive to solving the consumer problem, or at least trying to respond. What is going to be interesting is to see how you navigate those inherent tensions between stakeholders, because sometimes doing so, you know, people tend to love glitter in the beauty category. Now they're saying, oh my God, this is terrible for waterways, or
Right.
microbeads in facial scrub. You know, so they're come down to very minute issues because we're good at scale today.
Very good.
I
Yeah.
think being very inclusive about who that customer base is, because we're actually gotten fairly good at designing things that a lot of people like, that a lot of people can talk about. We're kind of good on the production end. So we need to be much better at saying what is going to be possibly the unintended consequences when this scales, when this takes off.
Yeah.
And say, there's a couple of ways to respond to that. Say, all right, then how do I use that same expertise that I use to spur the consumption to say, how do I then encourage that person to complete the journey in a very interesting way? So during the Great Depression, for example, some of the companies in Kansas that were making flour that used to be sold in these sacks, the salesman came back to headquarters and said, you know what? There's a lot of people who are, and we're seeing that these flour sacks are being used to do all kinds of things in the household, from tea towels to, you know, clothing. And the response from the company was so interesting. They said, oh, if people are struggling, we have an obligation to help. So they printed the flour sacks with beautiful designs so that children who were going to school had pretty clothes to wear. And they also put their branding in a different type of ink and they gave women instructions on how to take the brand out. So there was never a stigma about making clothes from a flour sack. So it's an interesting view of saying, you know, the person, as they're buying the product, they already have a dream for what they're going to do, you know, with the packaging. And that's just, you know, one small example. And, you know, you see some of the archives and they have ones that were printed with cutouts of teddy bears. So, you know, moms could make a toy for their children. And so I think that real blend of design, but that's what we're talking about with empathy and compassion and really understanding the life journey. I'm sure there's so many more solutions we can come up with. So everyone's now plastic is the villain. I said, well, when it's paper waste, I have a shredder. When it's food scraps, I have a compost bin. There's some options. We don't have a way to start a ritual with plastic. You know, so how do you then introduce these new things which people can adopt, they can talk about, they can scale much faster? I'm very hopeful that when people design something that works, the scaling can happen because of the evolution of technology faster and more globally than it has in the past.
No, I think without a doubt, it's happening a lot faster than it ever has. We were talking a couple of weeks ago in San Diego about, and both of us have spent a lot of time overseas and have a love of what's going on in emerging markets. What's your thought on designing product or design in terms of emerging markets? I mean, I don't know. I know that we design products. I mean, I was guilty of it in the toy business. I didn't design for the products that would end up in other countries. That we designed for, you know, the U.S. market. And is there what do you mean? What do you think about that and designing for this in that sector?
Well, the interesting thing is that, you know, in the past 20 years, through a combination of policy, a corporate behavior, we've really seen almost more than 1 billion people move out of extreme poverty. So there are actually a lot of new consumers out there. You know, you actually have smartphones and cell phones in the hands of almost everybody, regardless of income. And you also have payments infrastructure in place for the first time. And I think people tend to really focus on technology of saying that, well, now I can sell and I can communicate. But one of the other exciting pieces that you've actually radically reduced the cost of learning. You don't have to guess at people's preferences as much anymore. You can ask them directly by forming those relationships. And if the really interesting thing is that if you look at what's been adopted at scale by even the poorest people in the world, it's basically cell phones, branded fashion, education, and personal care items. So all of those are really reflections of aspiration, not kind of the traditional view of need. And I
Right.
think the challenge is really going to be, how do you kind of solve a real problem? From now on too, where it's going to become a challenge everywhere. Some of these things are going to be, how do I solve a really interesting problem, like how people use energy in their homes, or how they're thinking about consumption, but do it in a way that appeals to their aspirations, not basically by shaming them and telling them that,
Yep.
somehow the choices you're making are harmful, but you just kind of gently nudge and inspire people to behave differently. And, people are sensitive to this. The person who is, a farm entrepreneur understands climate change. So I say, like, the nice thing today is that when you're starting new businesses and reimagining how things could be, you have the luxury to be inclusive at birth. And if we just envision how things will work for a much wider range of people, that's probably the best tool we have to be very impactful, because those problems are felt. I mean, I grew up like, oh my God, you go back to India for a visit, make sure you boil the water or carry your own bottled water. I would eat the food because it's usually cooked, but I was very careful with water. I grew up in Michigan. You see Flint having, a
Yeah.
similar problem for a different set of reasons. Or, when people are flooded out or whatever, like, we need to have plan A, plan B, plan C in a lot of environments. Okay, if the power is out, if something else happens, can we have a whole arsenal of ways to deal with things and allow people to kind of exist in a dignified manner, right? So I've seen people designing devices like, oh, here's a hand cranked defibrillator. Well, okay, when we have a hurricane or we have an emergency or whatever, those things are tremendously useful regardless of the environment,
Right.
for
Wherever
completely
you
different sets of
where,
reasons.
yeah, wherever you are, right.
And so therefore, I think that, and the other interesting thing is that even what's happened with income distribution around the world as well is that a lot of people who are considered maybe upper middle class in emerging markets have incomes that are very similar to kind of a lot of people retired or military families or people who are kind of the struggling segment of millennials. So there's actually now some, hard like income equalization, but the way those two parties are treated is very different. I mean, in emerging markets, they would be offered very exciting, interesting products, and here it's not as much the case. And so I think if you design in a really aspirational way, you can potentially have bigger markets than we've ever had before. So a company like Target can take this big data and say, you know what, we're going to design, we know this is what people are buying, so we're going to design this very effective, no frills beauty care brand where we have like 50 items that are under $2. They don't need to do any adjustment to go anywhere in the world now. They need the distribution and the relationships and things, but the product itself is already there at a price point that's affordable. And so that's kind of exciting. It wasn't the case in the past. And if I look at e-commerce in India and stuff, some of these remote, northeastern regions, apparently Korean beauty products are huge over there because they're able to discover, they have leisure time. And, so
Right.
they're saying, okay, well, maybe the Chanel may not be affordable, but some of these really trendy, awesome, interesting, Asian beauty brands are worth experimenting with. So there's like interesting pockets that emerge around the world is what I just find absolutely fascinating.
Is there so I mean that's a great I love that because I one of the things that um, I think is the big opportunity for growth, right? Is taking business overseas and looking at other markets. And I agree with you 100%. I think that the ability to do that today is just so much better than it has been. And I mean, I was just in Africa for a couple of years, um, and I lived in Africa for a couple of years. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me is the emergence of all these payment like the way to pay for someone for goods, because so many people are sort of non-banked there. They're in the
Yes.
non-traditional, and it's always been really hard to say have a product made in China and ship it to Africa because there was no real payment way to make the payment happen, right? And now with solving that issue and being able to do transactions overseas at a reasonable rate, I think, and with shipping getting better and better and better, I think some of these challenges that sort of hindered business are really going to go away. And I think that is there an easy way to, well, not an easy way, but what's the best way to explore? I mean, I'm just asking your thought. What's the best way to explore taking a product overseas or testing it in a market? Is there to see if it has that it fits? Is there a good way to do that or
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is that, victim of it myself, when you're in business school, you have these very complicated frameworks. And I think sometimes just looking at how successful entrepreneurs locally have thought about an issue is so fun. I actually have a friend named Irene Sun who's written a book called The Next Factory of the World. And she is Chinese origin. And she's explored how a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs set up businesses in Africa and are really playing an important role in industrializing. And one of the stories in that was there was a Chinese entrepreneur who said, well, labor costs are rising, so I need to maybe go overseas to Africa, see what's out there. So, instead of doing any complicated market analysis, he went to his friend at the port and said, what is the most expensive thing you ship out to Africa? And, how much does it cost? And they said, well, our most expensive thing that we ship out that we can't keep up with is, porcelain and ceramic floor tile. So he said, okay, that's the factory I'm going to set up. Market analysis all done.
wow?
But I think really trying to understand aspirations. I always tell, entrepreneurs that a lot of the poverty you see is about a lack of choices. It's not about a lack of information, because we're all on our phones today. People are seeing pictures, they're under some understanding. So when you translate a lot of the things that people are looking at and make them accessible, that's the secret. That's what all of the great businesses in America traditionally did too. That's what Sears' mission was, right? Is that let's give you a kit for building a house. And I think that actually a lot of the American prosperity was created in understanding this much earlier than everyone else did. So we don't actually need to relearn some of it. We need to remember, because the rest of the world is going on a very similar journey. And of course, there are tweaks and new tools like technology. You can, as I said, do things in a much more collaborative fashion rather than having all the designs dictated by the firm. But the process is similar. And that's the kind of exciting part. Like I work with an entrepreneur who's done kind of sustainable roofing. And what was so interesting to me is the minute he was convinced that this wasn't going to leak, the next week he went out and ordered imported wallpaper and put it up because he said his wife had always loved wallpaper. And it was this like very, flowery Bollywood type of stuff. But, I went directly from India to Vienna, and they checked me in, met me at the airport, checked me into a beautiful hotel. And I walked in and I was like, that is the exact same wallpaper. So, you kind of say, wow, this is one of those signals that, the world is getting a little bit smaller despite all appearances. So I think this is the cool thing is that, Macy's, everybody ships overseas, when you go and browse from anywhere in the world, they just automatically translate into currency. So people are looking at things. And like I said, we have the ask. Before, it was so difficult to get at that information. It was very difficult for even the best meaning people to make decisions because you had to go put yourself up in a hotel and go out with a translator, and then you never were sure because you're saying, well, I did talk to 8 people and it was very compelling, but do I really go and ask a big company to make huge investments and huge decisions on the basis of my emotion, right? But now you can assemble and you can observe actual purchasing behavior because, like I said, you have people in all income categories today who are making payments online. So you can kind of take some bets based on actual behavior. But I would say, if you're looking at social impact, there's really 3 big things. I define CSR a little differently. Just say it's choices, support, and recourse. Those are the 3 big things that move impact because the causes of inequality around the world are different. Some places it's civil war, some places it's cultural beliefs, the list goes on.
Right.
The manifestation for individuals is depressingly familiar. It's just a lack of choice that kind of infects every aspect of your existence. And what business does really well is it expands the range of choices available. And I think just in doing that, you are making a big impact. Being able to say, I'm going to go to night school or online school versus a 4-year university. Or I don't have time to go to the bank, so I'm going to use an app. And having those choices on its own creates productivity, creates income, and it helps you get to a better life. So you don't have to create a perfect solution. You have to create choices. I think that's something I slowly came to terms with because you want to have like a solution for all problems. That's not really going to happen most of the time for any group. And nobody's so desperate that they're going to hand over all their life decisions to you anyway.
But we often think about it in the context of solutions, right? And not choices. And that's the way we think about it.
Yeah, I think creating choices is one. The other thing is that information in and of itself doesn't move behavior. Even if you agree, when people are able to make changes and exercise choice is when they have support, right? I mean, you can have all the information possible. You know what? You still need the friend to show you how to use Facebook or how to use LinkedIn in a more effective way or show you some little features. So creating infrastructure to give people support on that journey is huge. So anything that a company does or an individual does, information is not sufficient. Support, really important. And I think the third pillar is that whatever your intentions are, there are always some unintended consequences. There are problems that arise. Providing recourse, a way for people to be heard when they encounter a problem, is the third really big thing that you can think about when you're talking about impact. And it really, this is not something that depends on anybody's income or whatever. I think that this is where, companies succeed or fail is sometimes on that third pillar is that, all right, you know what, I was harmed. It may not have been your fault, but it's still your problem. And how do we take it forward? And you'll see like an airline complain, someone's complaining about, oh, somebody reclined on me, and they are mediating kind of sometimes silly, superfluous things. And other times they're saying, you know what, somebody had a right to post this, but this is how it really harmed my life. This was a Yelp review that put my family on the street and it wasn't even true. And, how do I mitigate that? And you need to really have, sometimes on the fly, really have these debates. But I think also the good point about that is being able to debate those fundamental questions of fairness and equity is also a huge advantage. The companies that manage these things well are the ones that tend to endure.
Yeah, no, and it's becoming even more imperative today. I mean, I think for you to understand that this is that you have to have these conversations internally and think about these things in terms of strategy and what your culture is. And I mean, it's got to be so ingrained, I think, today in the business that because I just think that it's the only way, as you said, that you're going to survive in this sort of new information world that we have. What is for you? We talked about storytelling a little bit. How do you? I want to go back because we started talking about it. How do you incorporate that into your design? I mean, are there processes, best practices, things that you need to sort of? I mean, because to me, I think most companies would have to rethink the whole way they do design, because you said it earlier and we didn't get to talk about it, but you design a product and then you hand it over to marketing to market, right? Mm-hmm. To me now it's a more integrated process, and you hit on it a little bit, but I want to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think what is interesting is you can kind of design touch points and the way people navigate that process. From a lot of people will start out around the world online, for example. And okay, even if they're spurred to purchase, they'll kind of come back online to validate their choice. So what you need to do in the storytelling process is make content and pieces of things shareable. That's really interesting, really important to your brand. You can't be the only person saying, this is the product and this is how it was created. It's actually very powerful to have your customers helping fulfill that role along with you, amplifying whatever the process was going. I say, oh, this is actually why this is different and this is why it's better. And if you look now on social media and stuff, you'll see people like they want to share that excitement from the time the package arrives. They want to unbox it with an audience and say, this is how I use it. And you also have to allow some room for people to express their own identity with that, whether it's an inexpensive, like toy where you have the 6-year-old saying, look, I put these two together. You almost have to kind of design for compatibility, not complete exclusivity in many categories. I mean, definitely in pharma or something, you don't want people mixing, things that they shouldn't be.
So in other words, involve the customer in the process. Is that, so, I mean, I guess, is that through online?
In the book, we really talk about saying, how do you transform that customer into hero? How do you make them the person who is coming back and telling the world about their discovery along the way? You create that of like, okay, here's this moment of truth, this thing I clicked together. I was able to, do these 3 steps just like they said, and do this for large numbers of people. Like, oh, okay, you know what? We all had this similar experience when we went into Starbucks, but it felt like we had our name written on the cup. And, you create those moments of individual acknowledgement, but also kind of this feeling of equality and community. And, this is the thing that the other reason why storytelling aspect is becoming more and more important is simply because the number of product introductions, the number of things people release is increasing. And by definition, innovation can't be successful all the time. And what allows people to be forgiven and to continue to earn your business is really when they understand your intentions, what you were trying to do. And stories are really important ways to communicate and allow people to understand what you were trying to do. So sometimes those connections are even more important when something doesn't work out. Now, so Samsung's Galaxy phone, I mean, if something exploded in my front pocket, I don't think I would be rushing to, forget, but
Yeah.
it recovered remarkably quickly because people really liked the phone and they were always updating people, this is what I'm doing to deal with the problem. I
Yeah.
saw 100,000 phones that were like this. I smashed them all as the CEO. And here's what I'm going to do to make it right. And people responded to that.
Yeah.
And so I think that some of these, that might be an extreme, but also kind of showing, when you spend a lot of time studying consumers and things, sometimes you get insights that are like beyond what you're trying to design for. When, things like laundry, for example, you discover, that's why they call it dirty laundry. You discover things about a household, that maybe people don't want known. So I think having that conversation, you still have to wait for permission to incorporate some of these ideas. There's some things that you want to say, okay, here is this cool idea I had. Other things you have to wait for the invitation as a company to say, well, can you help me solve this problem too? That may be much more personal, where it doesn't feel creepy. Sometimes that's where a lot of companies get in trouble with data and all that. You can probably sites that maybe everyone doesn't want you to have. And so it's a very delicate process of taking people along on a journey and saying, okay, you are in control of this. And I think that under the hood, the narrative about how you do things is becoming more and more important because, like I said, the offering itself, we've gotten a lot better at testing. We've gotten a lot better at asking and listening.
Yeah.
But today, what a lot of people are asking about is the how. How are you delivering things? And that matters as well. So, I mean, you saw like before, years ago, Nike was on blast for saying, well, your labor conditions in some of your factories is terrible. But today, all of us are saying, well, wait a minute. I like Uber. It shows up on time. But I'm not necessarily comfortable with some of the cultural aspects. I'm not necessarily comfortable with how you're compensating your workers over
Right.
time. A lot of these how questions when companies succeed become more and more important. And so you actually end up having to talk about those things much more openly with a much wider audience. And that wasn't something that was always there, because it was always like, oh, product, you like it, you buy it.
Right.
Now the business model side is actually under more scrutiny than it ever has been across categories, whether it's pharma, banking, tech for sure. And those conversations are actually being heard and decisions are being made by a lot of people of all ages, of all ethnicities and nationalities. And you have to really understand how to communicate. And on the other hand, you see the companies that do it well, the Microsofts of the world who are saying, well, this is the world evolving. And this is how we're designing LinkedIn to help you find opportunity in the world. People respond to that too. A lot of people engage simply to be inspired. So that's a power that companies can leverage as well.
No, you're absolutely right about that, and it's a great reminder that the how is really, really, really important, and I think bringing people along. I like that idea of kind of bringing people along on the journey, and I think that's, I mean, you see these unboxing. You brought it up, these unboxing videos now. They're just incredible. My kids watch those, and I don't know why, but I you know. But it does make and create so many tools today to do that so much easier than it's ever been, I think, ever been able to do. Well, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you, Rhett, for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation and look forward to keeping in touch.
Absolutely. And thank you for spending some time with us today on your lunch break or in the morning or wherever you are in the world.
Yeah.
Thanks for spending some time with us. You can look at the schedule, find out more about the schedule on powerlunch.live. And we also take the show on the road. We do these programs live at your event or your conference. So please be in touch if you're interested in having a LinkedIn Live program at your event. Anyway, until next week, until next Tuesday, have a great weekend. Go out and do good work in the world, and we'll see you then.
Great. Thanks, Rhett. Have a great weekend.
Bye bye.